the end of the last video, we left off with the stock rails for the standard gauge diverging route, the narrow gauge diverging route, and the common rail through route attached to the template. Now we're going to work on the point rails, which the point rails are the rails that will move as the turnout is thrown for either the diverging route or the through route. What we need now are 3 lengths of rail as long as our template. I've pre-cut those. The next step is going to be to cut a taper to make the point of the point rail nice and sharp. And you can see on the template that at the point itself, about half of the width of the rail has been removed. All of the side of the rail head and the base of the rail down to the web at least. And then it tapers out to full thickness about here. And on my turnout, this is about 2 3/8 inches. I'm going to taper mine a little farther, 2 3/4 inches. So now what I would need to do is I need to mark the side of the rail that will have the material removed. So this is going to be my point rail for my through route, my common rail through route, and I'll mark the side that is going to have the material removed. Here is the diverging route, narrow gauge rail, and I'll mark that side that needs to have the rail removed. And the standard gauge is the same as the narrow gauge. I'll just use this because it's convenient, and I mark the side. So now we're going to move to the point where we're going to file that rail down. So again, I've used contact cement to hold my template down to a piece of plywood. And this is a plywood with a very fine, smooth top grade, veneer. In it I've taken a hacksaw blade and I've cut a groove in just the top veneer. And this holds the rail still for these next sections. So I'm going to put the end of my rail next to the end of my board, and this mark represents where I need to start the taper for the point. By the time I get down to this end of the point, I want to have the rail base and the rail head removed and just be starting to take off material from the rail web. At this end, I want all of the original rail base, web, and rail head to be intact. So this is a gradual taper. And I'll go ahead and do that now. With the rough filing done on the points, I'm now going to dress it up with a flat needle point file. And as a final touch-up to the point rails, I want to make sure that the end of the rail has a perfectly perpendicular end. So I'm going to take my rail nipper and just take the slightest little bit off and make sure that it has a nice sharp point. And that's the end of preparing the point rails. Next, we're going to lay the point rails onto the template. Okay, so the next thing that I want to do is I want to start to lay the point rails onto the template. The first one that I'm going to do is the point rail through the through route for the narrow gauge. And the reason is it's all open. I don't have to cross over any frogs or anything of that nature. So I'm going to start by placing my point in the appropriate spot. I'm going to take just a little needle driver and just clamp the rail into place to hold it there. Then I'm going to start with my HO rail spacers, and this is going to hold my gauge of my ON30 narrow gauge track. Because ON30 is HO, I can use these rail spacers. So I'll set a few of these on here just to hold the rail in place. I'm not going to drive any spikes yet. What I want to do is I just want to drill some pilot holes for the spikes, as we've done in the previous video. So again, I come to the inside, drill a pilot hole, on the outside, and drill a pilot hole. I'll do that for the remainder of my places that I want to secure the rail. With the pilot holes completed, I'm going to go ahead and spike the narrow gauge point rail for the through route in position. So, with the narrow gauge point rail for the through route spiked in place, I'm going to use my NMRA standards gauge in HO to check the track. Even though I laid it down with a track gauge, I just want to make sure. It's a little wide at this point. A little push in, check it again, still a bit wide, and it's good. Now, we're going to lay the standard gauge or common rail diverging route point rail. And you can see here that the route of that rail crosses over the narrow gauge through route. And we don't have a frog made yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this rail out of the template beyond a point that it interferes with the path of the diverging route common rail point. And now I'll take one of my rails that's been cut for the diverging route common rail. I'm going to use my needle driver to just hold the rail together here. And we begin the same process of drilling the pilot holes prior to actually laying the rail. But again, this is now my standard gauge, which is ON48, and there is no ON48 gauge. So I'm going to set my dial caliper to my 1-inch gauge. Then what I'll do is at each of the locations where the standard gauge diverging route has been secured, I'm going to pull the rail against my caliper and drill a pilot hole. The inside of the base, the outside of the base, and I could continue to do that for the remainder. I think what I'd like to do is just go ahead and secure this one with a set of spikes, because it's so close to that tapered portion of the point that it's a little flimsy here. So we'll go ahead and spike that down. Okay, with the common rail, diverging route point rail now secured, I'm going to come back and make sure that it's in gauge. So this is my 1-inch gauge. I'm going across each of the spike points. Gauge is a little broad there perhaps, and right on there, so this set of spikes needs to come in just a little bit. Good, good. And it's good down through the points. So we now have the common rail diverging route point rail in. The final rail that we want to put into position today is the standard gauge diverging or point rail for the through route. And as we lay that in position, you can see that it crosses the narrow gauge diverging route stock rail, and it crosses the common route, or the common rail diverging route point rail. So I want to move those two rails out of the way so that this through route point rail for the standard gauge can be laid in. So again, I'll just pull them slightly out of the template until they no longer cross the path of that through route standard gauge point rail. I'll pull that one out. And now I can begin to lay the standard gauge point rail in. Now I've got a conflict here already. I can see that I have one set of spikes for the narrow gauge diverging route stock rail that are going to have to come out. So I'll remove those. I'll lay my rail in place, and again with my needle driver I'll secure the point rail into the position on the standard gauge diverging route stock rail. Again, because this is the standard gauge, I don't have an NMRA gauge. I just have my caliper set to 1 inch. So I'm going to come about halfway down the rail and just drill some pilot holes. This rail is a little ungainly for some reason. So let's see what I can do to tighten that up. Okay. Outside pilot hole. Inside pilot hole. I'm going to spike this one down. So, inside spike. Outside spike. Let's check the gauge. A little tight. We'll press out on the spikes a little bit. Got a spike here that's also interfering. We're going to have to pop that one out. Check the gauge. Again, just a little tight. Good. So now what I'll do is I'll go in and I'll secure the standard gauge point rail for the through route at all of my securing points. Okay, with the spiking of the through route standard gauge point rail, I'm going to come back and I'm going to check the gauge for the entire route. It's a little tight here. Give that a little adjustment. continues to be a little tight right here. Just another little adjustment, pushing the rail outward. That worked well. Okay, so now what we've done is we have made a spiked, secured position for all 6 of our rails. The stock rail for common, the stock rail for the diverging narrow gauge, the stock rail for the diverging standard gauge, the point rail for the diverging common, the point rail for the through route narrow gauge, and the point rail for the diverging or through route standard gauge. Join me in the next video where we create the frogs for this dual gauge turnout.